My father-in-law said, "You eat after that. It's respect." My husband whispered, "Just go along with it." I smiled, nodded, and said, "Sure, but let's see if you like my tradition." The next day, they showed up to dinner and discovered what I had planned for them instead. I didn't expect my first dinner with my in-laws to be a defining moment in my marriage. Sure, I knew Aaron's parents were traditional. He had warned me plenty of times before we got engaged. But warnings don't always prepare you for the real thing. And nothing could have prepared me for Frank. The kind of man who carried his beliefs like a shield, who spoke as if his word was law, and who believed respect was something women gave, not something they deserved in return. We had been married for only a few months when Aaron suggested dinner at his parents' house. "It'll be good," he said. "They want to see you more." He made it sound simple, normal, but there was something in the way he said it, a hesitation in his voice, like he was trying to convince himself as much as me. I should have paid attention to that. I wanted to believe his parents were just old-fashioned and harmless ways. Maybe they liked to keep holiday traditions alive, or they believed in Sunday church, or they used landlines instead of smartphones. I could handle that. But what I didn't expect was a family dinner that would feel more like a performance, one where I was expected to play a role I had never agreed to. When we arrived, Linda, Aaron's mother, was already bustling around the kitchen. She barely looked up as we walked in, her hands busy, her apron dusted with flour. "Oh, good," she said. "You can help set the table." It wasn't a request. Aaron had barely taken off his jacket when he was ushered to the living room by his father. "Come on, son, let's talk." That was it. No invitation for me to join them, no acknowledgement that I was standing right there. Linda handed me a stack of plates without missing a beat. "Put these out for the men," she said. I stared at her, waiting for her to say more, waiting for her to say and then set ours, but she didn't. She just turned back to the stove, humming under her breath. The realization settled in slowly. I wasn't supposed to set plates for myself or for her. Just for them. I went along with it because I wanted to observe. I wanted to see how far this would go. Maybe I was a misunderstanding. Maybe it wasn't as bad as it seemed. But it was. When everything was ready, Linda placed the food on the table, and the men sat down first. Not because they happened to get there first, not because they were hungrier, but because it was their right. And then Frank looked up at me, his voice full of authority, like a king addressing a servant. "Men eat first," he said. "Women eat after. It's respect." Just like that. Like it was nothing, like it was normal. I glanced at Aaron, expecting him to say something, to push back, to tell his father that we were married now, that we made our own rules, that I wasn't raised like this. But he only gave me a small, apologetic shrug, and murmured, "Just go along with it." And that was when it clicked. Aaron knew. He had always known. This wasn't something his father used to do. This wasn't a once-in-a-while thing. This was how Aaron was raised. And even though he had never made me feel less than him, even though we had always been equals in our own home, in this house, at this table, he was his father's son. I smiled, nodded. "Sure," I said. "But let's see if you like my tradition." Frank didn't ask what I meant. He didn't care. Why would he? I was just a woman, after all. But Aaron? He looked at me like he knew something was coming. He didn't know what, not yet, but he knew me, and he knew I wasn't going to let this go. The next night I cooked. I spent the whole afternoon making sure everything was perfect. A full meal steak, roasted vegetables, warm bread, homemade gravy. The smell of it filled the house, thick and inviting. When my in-laws arrived, Linda smiled approvingly. "It smells wonderful," she said. I gestured to the table, where everything was set. "Have a seat," I told them. "I'll bring the food over." Frank sat down at the head of the table like he belonged there. Aaron hesitated, looking at me for a long moment, but sat anyway. I brought the plates out one by one, first mine, then Linda's. And then I sat down. I took a bite. Frank frowned, glancing at the empty space in front of him. "Where's our food?" I wiped my mouth with my napkin, smiling. "The women eat first," I said lightly. "The men eat after. It's respect." Silence. Linda froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. Aaron exhaled through his nose, staring at his plate, like he wanted to disappear into it. Frank let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "You're joking." I took another bite. "Not at all. Just a little tradition I grew up with." His face reddened. "Well, I don't like it." I tilted my head. "Oh, you didn't seem to have a problem with it last night." His fingers clenched against the table. He was mad, but he couldn't say anything without contradicting himself, without admitting that his rules only worked in his favor. And so, for the first time in his life, he waited. He sat at that table, just like I had the night before. Hungry, silent, powerless, and I ate. Linda ate, too. Aaron? He didn't touch his food. He just stared at me, the same look in his eyes that he had given me the night before. Like he knew. Like he finally understood. Frank never apologized. I never expected him to. But something changed after that night. The next time we had dinner at their house, there was no announcement. No men first. Just a simple, quiet, let's eat. And for the first time, we ate as equals, as a family. And Frank? He never looked me in the eye again. The change at the dinner table didn't mean everything else changed overnight. If anything, it made things more complicated. Frank didn't speak to me much after that night, and when he did, it was always clipped, forced, like he was checking a box rather than actually talking to me. The tension didn't go away, it just shifted. Aaron, on the other hand, Wasn't sure how to handle any of it. Look, I get why you did it, he said one night, as we were getting ready for bed. But you didn't have to push like that. I turned to him. He sighed, rubbing his temples. You knew it would piss him off. I crossed my arms. You knew what he was like before I ever stepped into that house. You never warned me about the men eat first thing. Why? Aaron hesitated. I didn't think it was a big deal, that's the problem. He didn't have an answer to that. The next time we saw them was for Linda's birthday. She had invited us out to a steakhouse. A nicer place than I expected. One of those old-school restaurants with dark wood paneling, leather booths, and dim lighting. Frank must have picked it. It was the kind of place men like him liked. The kind where the waiters still called you sir and ma'am, where the whiskey was poured heavy, and where they probably still had some outdated dress code about women not wearing jeans. When we arrived, Frank was already there, sitting at the head of the table, as always. Linda sat beside him, smiling warmly at us. I'm so glad you made it, she said. I smiled back, but the air was tight, suffocating. Aaron shifted beside me, like he could feel it too. I sat across from Frank. He barely looked at me. The waiter came by, taking drink orders first. When he got to me, I asked for a glass of red wine. Frank snorted. Didn't take you for a wine drinker. I raised an eyebrow. What does that mean? He shrugged, picking up his glass of bourbon. Just figured you were more of a beer kind of girl. I knew what he meant. It wasn't a compliment. He meant loud, opinionated, difficult. I smiled. I like what I like. He didn't respond. When the food came, I wondered if he'd try something. Maybe a snide remark, maybe a half-joking should the men eat first tonight? But he didn't. Linda tried to keep the conversation light, asking about work, about upcoming plans, about whether Aaron and I were thinking of buying a house soon. But Frank? He barely acknowledged me, and honestly I preferred it that way. A week later, Aaron got a call from his mother. I was in the kitchen when I saw him standing by the living room window, phone pressed to his ear, nodding along to whatever she was saying. But something about his face was off, tense. After a while he said, I don't know, Mom. I'll talk to her. That was never a good sign. When he hung up, he turned to me with that same look I had seen after the dinner at our house. Like he knew something was coming.
What was that about?
I asked. He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. Mom wants us to come over for dinner again. I frowned. Okay. And? He exhaled. And Dad thinks we need to talk. There it was, the weight in his voice. The thing he wasn't saying. Frank wanted a reckoning. I smiled. Good. Aaron groaned, closing his eyes. Babe, no, I said, grabbing a plate from the sink. Let's go to dinner. Aaron leaned against the counter, watching me carefully. Promise me you won't start something. I turned to him. Promise me you'll finish something. He had no answer for that. The night of the dinner, I felt something heavy in my chest. Not quite anxiety, not quite anger, something in between. Frank had made it clear he wanted to talk, but I knew better. He didn't want a conversation. He wanted to put me in my place. Aaron drove with both hands gripping the wheel, his jaw tight. He didn't like conflict. He never had. But this wasn't just conflict. This was about the very foundation of how he was raised. The quiet, unspoken expectations that had been drilled into him since childhood. And I was about to shake those foundations again. When we arrived, Linda was already at the stove, cooking like nothing was wrong. She greeted us with a warm smile, but her eyes flickered to Aaron with something else, something almost pleading. Aaron gave a slight nod. I saw that, noticed that. They had already spoken. Frank sat at the dining table, newspaper in hand, acting like he wasn't waiting for us, but I knew better. The food was already half prepared, and when Linda turned off the stove, I moved to grab plates. She touched my arm lightly. I'll do it. I hesitated. It's okay. I can. I said. I'll do it. She smiled, but there was something in her voice. A quiet warning. I stepped back, watching as she set the plates exactly the way she always did. Men first. My jaw clenched. Frank didn't say a word. Didn't acknowledge the act. He just reached for his fork like this was how the world worked. How it had always worked. Aaron shifted uncomfortably beside me, but didn't move to stop it. I didn't sit. I didn't eat. I waited. Watched. Halfway through the meal, Frank wiped his mouth, leaned back in his chair, and finally spoke. You made quite a statement last time. I met his gaze. Did I? He gave a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. You think you proved something? I tilted my head. Did it feel good? Waiting for your food? His jaw tightened. You think you taught me a lesson? I smiled. Did I? His hands clenched into fists on the table. That's not how things work in this house. Ah, there it is. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. Then maybe this house needs to change. Frank's face darkened. I don't need a girl telling me how to run my family. Aaron sat up straighter. Dad? Frank held up a hand. No. She started this, so let's settle it, right now. Linda was staring at her plate, saying nothing. Aaron ran a hand through his hair, sighing. Dad, just listen. No. Frank snapped. I've listened enough. Then he looked at me. Voice sharp. You don't belong here if you can't respect how things are done. I exhaled slowly, feeling every muscle in my body tense. Aaron stiffened beside me. Dad. No. I lifted a hand, stopping him. Then I turned to Frank. My voice steady. Fun. I was about to say the same thing about you. Silence. Linda flinched. Aaron exhaled. And Frank? For the first time, he actually looked at me, like he was realizing something too late, like he had just made a mistake he couldn't take back. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, pressing against the walls of the dining room. Linda shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around her napkin, while Aaron ran a hand through his hair, staring down at his plate like he wished he could disappear. Frank didn't move, didn't blink. He was waiting for me to back down. I wouldn't. You're saying I don't belong here, I repeated, slow and deliberate, letting the words settle in the air. Why? Because I won't sit quietly while you treat me like I'm less than you. Frank's jaw flexed. He reached for his glass of whiskey, took a slow sip, then set it down with a sharp clink. You don't understand, he said, voice steady but tight. Respect is what holds a family together. It's what keeps order. The way we do things works. It's how I was raised. It's how Aaron was raised. And it's how things should stay. I let out a small, humorless laugh. Right. And who exactly benefits from this order? Frank's eyes darkened. Aaron shifted beside me. Dad. Frank slammed his palm against the table, rattling the silverware. Enough. Linda flinched, but she still didn't say a word. Aaron let out a slow breath. Dad. He tried again, quieter this time. Listen to yourself. Frank turned his glare toward his son. Oh, I'm listening. And you? You just sit there while your wife disrespects me in my own home? Aaron exhaled through his nose. I don't think respect means what you think it means. Frank's expression twisted. That's so. He let out a short laugh, shaking his head. Look at you, letting a woman tell you what to do. You used to be better than this. Something flickered in Aaron's face. A flash of something old and painful, something I didn't recognize, but I saw the way his fingers curled against his leg, the way his throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. This wasn't just about me. This had been happening long before I ever stepped into this house. I'm still the same person, Aaron said finally. His voice was tight, strained. I just don't believe in the same BLSHT anymore. Frank's face reddened. Watch your mouth. Aaron let out a short, bitter laugh. You don't get to tell me what to do anymore. Linda looked up sharply, eyes flicking between them, the tension cutting through the air like a blade. I expected Frank to explode, to yell, to do something. Instead, he just stared at Aaron, his fingers tightening around the whiskey glass. You're a fool, Frank said finally. His voice was quiet, but the weight of it hit like a punch. You let her turn you against your own family. Against me. Aaron's hands curled into fists, but I reached out, placing a hand over his. Steady. Calm. Then I looked at Frank. Your family isn't just the people who follow your rules. I said. It's the people who stand by you even when they disagree. It's the people who love you for who you are, not for what you can control. Frank's jaw tightened. Aaron exhaled. Linda sat frozen. Then, quietly, she spoke for the first time that night. She's right. Frank snapped his head toward her, stunned. But Linda wasn't looking at him. She was looking at me. And there, in the flickering candlelight of that dinner table, I saw it. Years of silence. Years of going along with it. Years of swallowing her words, of pushing herself aside for the sake of keeping order. She had spent a lifetime waiting. And now, for the first time, she wasn't. Frank stared at Linda like he hadn't heard her correctly, like the woman sitting next to him, the one who had spent decades at his side, had just become a stranger. What did you just say? He asked, his voice dangerously low. Linda sat up a little straighter, smoothing the napkin on her lap with a quiet kind of finality. I said she's right. Frank let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking his head. You're just saying that because she's got you all worked up. No. Linda turned to him, her voice steady. I'm saying it because it's true. The room fell into complete silence. Aaron was frozen beside me, his fingers still curled into his palm. I didn't move either. This wasn't my moment. This was her. Linda took a slow breath, then reached for her glass of water, lifting it with both hands before setting it back down, like she was organizing her thoughts, weighing them carefully before letting them out. I've been cooking for this family for over 30 years, she said, setting the table, serving the food, making sure everyone else is comfortable before I even sit down. And I never once complained. Not because I agreed with it, but because I thought it was easier that way. She looked at Frank, and there was something sharp in her expression. Something new, but easier doesn't mean better. Frank scoffed, looking at Aaron now, as if waiting for him to jump in, to side with him. You hearing this? Aaron's jaw clenched. Yeah, Dad, I am. Frank exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the table like he was holding himself back. This is what happens when you let people start questioning tradition. Next thing you know, whole damn world goes upside down. Linda tilted her head. Or maybe it just stopped spinning around you. Frank's mouth opened slightly, like he was about to argue, but nothing came out. Linda pressed her lips together, nodding to herself like she had just settled something inside her. Then she stood up. Frank frowned. Where are you going? She picked up her plate. To eat in the living room. Frank blinked. You what? Linda turned to me. Want to join me? I smiled, standing up with my plate. Absolutely. Aaron followed, grabbing his own. We didn't say another word to Frank, didn't ask him to come, didn't wait for permission. We just left him there, sitting alone, at the head of a table that didn't belong to him anymore. That was the last time Frank ever tried to tell me where I belonged. At first, he thought it was a phase. He ignored it, thinking if he just waited it out, things would go back to normal. They didn't. Linda stopped serving him first at dinner. Sometimes she wouldn't even set the table. She'd plate her own food and sit down before he even got his fork in his hand. And if he made a comment about it, she'd just give him a calm, steady look and say, "You have two hands." And he stopped waiting for his father's approval. I watched him shed that weight, little by little, like a coat he didn't realize he had been wearing his whole life. And Frank? He had to sit with it, with all of it, with the knowledge that the world he had controlled for decades, the one where respect was just another word for obedience, had crumbled in front of him, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do to put it back together.
Hey everyone, want to win 4 NBC Palm Springs VIP tickets to watch entertainment icons Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons? Then click the link. The concert is Friday, November 8th at the Special Events Center at Fantasy Springs Resort.
You can win 4 NBC tickets to watch Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons. It's simple. Just click the link, scroll to the cool page, then enter for your chance to win 4 tickets and watch the show from the NBC Palm Springs seats at Fantasy Springs Resort.
Again, 4 NBC Palm Springs VIP tickets to watch Frankie Valli and the Four Seasons can be yours, so click the link. Good luck.